In the year 57 BCE, Julius Caesar was only in the second campaigning season of his Gallic command. Yet he was already transforming the political landscape of the region. The previous year had seen him crush the Helvetii and drive them back into their homelands, an act that had alarmed not just the Gauls to the south, but also the peoples of the north. These northerners were known collectively as the Belgae, a confederation of tribes inhabiting the lands between the rivers Marne and Rhine, roughly modern-day Belgium and northern France. They were considered by Caesar himself to be the bravest of the Gauls, not out of flattery, but because they lived furthest from Roman luxury, closest to the fierce Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and were hardened by constant war. The Belgae had good reason to be wary. They saw how Rome imposed its rule step by step, first through alliance, then tribute, then garrisons, and finally annexation. The Helvetii had fallen, and the Aedui in central Gaul had already become Roman allies. If Rome was not stopped now, the Belgic heartland would be next. Thus, in an extraordinary act of unity, the Belgae formed a grand tribal confederation. Tribal rivalries were set aside. From the Suitians and Nervi to the Aderbates, the Bellovaci, and many smaller clans, warriors gathered in their tens of thousands. Ancient sources, particularly Caesar's own commentaries, inflate this number to almost 300,000. Modern historians applying logistical analysis estimate around 50,000 to 60,000 warriors, still enough to rival Caesar's full strength. These were not lightly armed peasants, but seasoned fighters. The Belgae were influenced by both Celtic and Germanic traditions of war. They fought in large tribal war bands, each bound by kinship and loyalty to their chieftains. They carried long iron swords for slashing and close combat, heavy spears, gisum, both for throwing and thrusting, great oval shields, often painted, reinforced with bronze bosses. Some wealthier warriors wore chainmail or bronze helmets, though most relied on speed and ferocity. The elite rode in chariots or on horseback, but most fought as infantry. Their strategy was simple but terrifying: massed frontal assaults, designed to overwhelm the enemy through courage, noise, and sheer numbers. In past Gallic warfare, such tactics were often enough to smash weaker foes. But against Rome, this would prove dangerously insufficient. Meanwhile, Caesar commanded 8 Roman legions, around 50,000 infantry, plus Gallic cavalry auxiliaries. His legions were relatively fresh, some recently raised in Italy, but already hardened by the Helvetian campaign, each legionary carried. The pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact and render enemy shields useless. The gladius hispaniensis, a short stabbing sword ideal for thrusting in tight formations. The scutum, a large curved shield offering full body protection. Armor varied. Wealthier veterans in chainmail, larica hamada, newer recruits in lighter gear. Unlike the tribal host, Caesar's army was a machine of discipline and engineering. Roman soldiers drilled endlessly, fought in formation, and relied on officers to coordinate maneuvers. Behind them marched engineers, scouts, and logisticians, the invisible backbone of Roman success. Caesar understood the stakes. If the Belgae crushed him here, Rome's presence in Gaul would collapse. His political enemies in Rome would seize the chance to undermine him. But if he could defeat this vast tribal coalition, his reputation would soar, not only in Gaul, but across the Republic. Thus, as the Belgic Confederation advanced, burning fields and villages to deny him supplies, Caesar marched to meet them. He chose his ground carefully, encamping near the Axona River, modern Ain, on high ground. This position gave him water, a natural barrier to his rear, and the ability to control a bridge for supplies. It was a defensive masterpiece. Even if outnumbered, his army would not be easily surrounded. For days, the Belgae and Romans faced one another across the plains. The Belgic warriors roared insults, beat their shields, and dared Caesar to come down and fight on open ground. But Caesar was patient. He would not be drawn into a reckless charge. Instead, he let time gnaw at the Belgic host, and time was on his side. A tribal coalition of this size could not remain united for long. Supplies were limited, tempers short, and loyalties fragile. Caesar knew that hunger, frustration, and tribal politics could weaken them before swords were even crossed. Yet he also knew the Belgae would not simply retreat. At some point, they would make a bold move, and when they did, Caesar would be ready to turn it against them. When Caesar reached the Axona, he knew the battlefield itself would decide the campaign. The Belgae had the advantage in numbers, tens of thousands of warriors. Some say 300,000, though more likely 60,000. But Caesar's advantage lay in preparation, discipline, and engineering. He selected a ridge beside the Axona River for his camp. This was not chance. The river protected his rear and one flank, and he had access to clean water. Most importantly, he could use the river as both a shield and a weapon. His engineers, the unsung heroes of every Roman campaign, immediately set to work. Within days, the legions had fortified a camp with deep ditches, earth ramparts, and wooden palisades, constructed watchtowers along the walls to repel sudden attacks, secured a bridge across the Axona, which Caesar left under guard, ensuring his army could be resupplied from the far bank, dug trenches stretching out from camp, forcing the enemy to approach through narrow, killable lanes. To the Belgic tribes, this was baffling. They measured strength in charges and courage. Romans measured it in trenches, stakes, and time. The Belgae roared their challenge, urging Caesar to descend and meet them on the open plain. But Caesar knew better. He had no need to fight where the odds favored the enemy. Instead, both sides settled into a grim standoff. For days, the Roman and Belgic armies faced one another, separated by the river and the high ground. Skirmishes became daily ritual. Belgic cavalry charges thundered across the fields, but were met by Caesar's own horsemen and light infantry. Slingers from the Balearic Islands hurled lead shot with deadly accuracy, forcing warriors to retreat. Roman archers and javelin men kept the pressure constant. Inside the Belgic camp, tempers grew short. Their vast host consumed supplies at a terrifying pace. Each tribe had brought its own stores, but the coalition had no central system of supply like the Romans did. Fields had been burned in their march, denying them forage. As days passed without decisive battle, war councils grew heated. Chiefs accused one another of cowardice, of holding back warriors, of seeking private advantage. Caesar's patience was their torment. Inside the Roman camp, meanwhile, order reigned. Legionaries drilled, repaired their kit, and improved fortifications. Each night, Strict rotations of sentries watched the walls. Caesar moved through the camp constantly, speaking to his men, praising their work, assuring them that victory would come. His calmness projected confidence. Where tribal leaders shouted and argued, Caesar reassured and prepared. The longer the standoff dragged on, the more the balance shifted. The Belgae had come expecting a quick, glorious clash. Instead, they found themselves bogged down, starving, and slowly unraveling under the weight of their own size. Caesar had turned their numbers into a weakness, yet the Belgae were not finished. If the Romans would not come down to fight, then the tribes would find another way. Scouts scoured the river, searching for weaknesses. Soon, word came back of a ford downstream, shallow enough for thousands to cross. If they could strike Caesar's camp from behind, they could trap him between the river and their vast host. The standoff was about to explode into sudden violence. The standoff could not last forever. Each day the Belgic warriors grew more restless. They had marched far from their homelands, dragging carts, wagons, and families only to sit across the river from Caesar. They wanted glory, not idleness. In their councils, chiefs argued over what to do. To attack the fortified Roman camp head-on was suicidal. The trenches and walls were too strong. Yet to retreat without battle would shatter their unity and invite shame. Then came a stroke of inspiration. Scouts returned with news of a ford downstream, a place where the Axona ran shallow enough for men to wade across. If the tribes could secretly cross there in force, they might fall upon Caesar's rear, burn his bridge, and cut off his supply line. The Romans would be trapped between river and host, unable to flee, forced into a battle on Belgic terms. It was a daring plan, bold enough that it might change the war entirely. At dawn, the warriors moved. Under the cover of early mist, thousands of Belgae poured into the water, shields raised above their heads, spears gripped tightly. The river surged against their thighs and waists, slowing their advance. Horses snorted and struggled in the current as riders urged them forward. Still, the warriors pressed on, shouting battle cries, their mass forming a solid wall of men pushing for the far bank. But Caesar had anticipated this very move. His cavalry patrols had spotted the activity, and Roman discipline swung into action. He dispatched cohorts supported by Gallic horsemen and light infantry. As the Belgic warriors stumbled up the muddy banks, exhausted from the crossing, they were met with a hail of missiles. Pilla crashed into shields, their iron shanks bending and warping, pinning the shields uselessly to warriors' arms. Arrows and slingstones rained down, breaking momentum before the enemy could form a solid line. Then the legionaries charged. Shields locked tight, blades stabbing in short, brutal thrusts, they drove into the disorganized mass at the water's edge. Unlike the tribal warriors who fought for individual honor, the Romans fought as one machine. Each man was a part of the wall, advancing step by step, cutting down foes who struggled to lift their weapons in the mud. Panic spread through the Belgae. Pressed from the front with no room to maneuver, many were forced back into the river. Those still crossing collided with those fleeing, and chaos exploded. Some drowned, dragged down by the weight of armor, or crushed beneath their comrades. Horses screamed as they slipped and flailed in the current. The once proud attempt at a secret ambush became a massacre in the water. Caesar himself and his commandery describes how the enemy were slaughtered while encumbered by the river, unable to resist the organized fury of his legions. For the Romans, it was a moment of triumph, a chance to demonstrate once again that discipline and foresight outweighed numbers and courage. By the time the survivors staggered back to their camp, the Belgic chiefs understood what had happened. They had gambled everything on a surprise maneuver, and Caesar had turned it into disaster. Their warriors had been humiliated, their unity shaken. And worst of all, Caesar had proven that even their boldest plans could be anticipated and crushed. The ford of the Axona had shown the tribes that the Roman general they faced was no ordinary opponent. He was patient, calculating, and merciless in exploiting mistakes. And from that moment, the Belgians' confidence began to unravel. After the disaster at the ford, the Belgic camp was shaken. Warriors returned soaked, wounded, and humiliated, their dead floating in the river or lying scattered along the banks. Confidence in their chieftains faltered. Yet the Belgic coalition was still vast, and its warriors still dangerous. They had not yet accepted defeat. Caesar understood this. He knew the tribes were still searching for a way to force him into open battle. But rather than give them the satisfaction, he intensified the pressure. His cavalry, both Roman and Gallic auxiliaries from allied tribes, became the cutting edge of his strategy. Each day, Caesar unleashed his mounted troops across the countryside. Their orders were simple: harass the Belgic supply lines, cut down foragers, and sow panic. Foraging was the lifeblood of the Belgic army. Unlike the Romans, they had no organized grain convoys or reserves. Each tribe was expected to feed its warriors from the surrounding countryside. But the countryside had already been ravaged during their march. Fields were scorched, villages looted, livestock driven off. Now, whenever Belgic foraging parties ventured out, they found themselves hunted. Roman cavalry, disciplined and heavily armored, struck like wolves. They rode in tight formations, their spears leveled, their shields ready. Supporting them were light infantry, nimble runners who kept pace to join in the fight on foot. Together, these mixed forces proved deadly. The Belgic warriors, skilled horsemen themselves, did not flee without resistance. Their cavalry countered, darting in and out of combat, hurling javelins and rallying around their tribal leaders. Clashes broke out in open fields, short, vicious melees of rider against rider, spear against sword. Dust rose in clouds, horses screamed, and men tumbled into the mud, crushed under hooves. But here discipline told that Roman cavalry, though fewer, fought in coordinated squadrons. They could wheel, feint, and regroup with precision. The Belgi, though brave, often charged wildly, each warrior seeking his own glory. Against Rome's order, their fury bled away into losses. Slowly, day by day, Caesar's raids bled the Belgic army of strength, and the psychological toll was even greater. Inside the Belgic camp, hunger gnawed at the warriors. Without steady supplies, rations dwindled. Arguments among the tribal chiefs grew fiercer. Some accused others of failing to protect their foragers. Others whispered of treachery, suspecting rival tribes of holding back food to preserve their own strength. And the psychological toll was even greater. Inside the Belgic camp, hunger gnawed at the warriors. Without steady supplies, rations dwindled. Arguments among the tribal chiefs grew fiercer. Some accused others of failing to protect their foragers. Others whispered of treachery, suspecting rival tribes of holding back food to preserve their own strength. Caesar, ever the opportunist, noted the change. In his commentary, he describes how the Belgic host grew restless and divided. What had begun as a united confederation was starting to fracture. Fear and mistrust crept in where once there had been unity. The raids had done their work. The Belgi had come as a storm. Now they were unraveling, scattered by the relentless hounding of Caesar's cavalry and the grinding hunger in their camp. The great coalition stood on the edge of collapse, and soon that collapse would come. The failure at the ford and relentless cavalry raids had shattered the morale of the Belgic coalition. Their warriors were exhausted, soaked and humiliated, while supplies ran dangerously low. Tribal leaders convened in council, their arguments bitter and unrestrained. Some urged an immediate withdrawal to protect their families and homelands. Others feared that retreat would forever tarnish their honor and reputations. Tension flared. The council was fractured, with mistrust spreading like wildfire. Finally, they agreed. They would retreat under cover of night, hoping to evade Caesar's legions and regroup in more defensible territory. Wagons were loaded hastily, campfires extinguished, and warriors assembled in silence. Yet Caesar, ever vigilant, had scouts patrolling the surrounding plains. By dawn, the Romans were aware of the movement. Caesar wasted no time. He dispatched his cavalry and light infantry to harass the retreating tribes. From the moment the Belgic host began to move, chaos began to erupt. Dust clouds rose as wagons overturned, horses panicked, and carts jammed the narrow roads. Warriors collided with one another, shouting orders, while Roman horsemen struck from the flanks and rear. The retreat, intended as a strategic withdrawal, turned quickly into a rout. On the field, Roman discipline dominated. Cavalry squadrons wheeled in formation, cutting down stragglers. Light infantry moved between wagons, firing arrows and slingstones, breaking any attempts to form defensive lines. The Belgic warriors, brave as they were, could not match the coordinated precision of Rome. Many fled in panic, abandoning shields, weapons, and even their fallen comrades. Horses stumbled and fell, dragging their riders into the mud. Families accompanying the warriors were caught in the chaos, adding to the disorder. By mid-morning, the retreat had become a catastrophic collapse. Tribes splintered, each heading for their own lands, leaving Caesar to claim the plains unopposed. The Belgic coalition, which had once promised to crush Rome, had dissolved in a single desperate withdrawal. Even as the Romans pursued, Caesar restrained his forces enough to avoid overextending. He understood that a cautious pursuit would destroy morale without risking his legions in a dangerous overreach. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with abandoned gear, broken wagons, and the occasional straggling warrior testimony to the devastation brought not just by weapons, but by discipline, strategy, and psychological pressure. In the aftermath, Caesar's legions regrouped. Though victorious, he remained alert. The Belgi had been battered, but their spirit had not been entirely crushed. Among them, some tribes would recover, reorganize, and resist in the campaigns to come. The great lesson was clear. Rome's combination of strategy, discipline, and relentless pressure could destroy even the bravest of foes without a single catastrophic frontal assault. And while the Axona had been won, Caesar already looked ahead. Across the rivers and forests of northern Gaul, the Nervi and other tribes were watching, waiting, and preparing. The next challenge, he knew, would test his legions in ways even the Ford could not. The day after the rout, the plains around the Axona were silent but for the occasional clatter of abandoned carts or the low cries of wounded warriors. The Belgic Confederation had collapsed. Tribes fled to their homelands, carrying with them tales of humiliation and defeat. Among the Switians, Belovasi, and other tribes, grief and anger mixed with relief at surviving, anger at the leaders whose decisions had cost so many lives. Families mourned the loss of sons and brothers. Entire villages had been emptied of men, leaving women and elders to defend what remained of their lands. Caesar's legions, disciplined and efficient, spent the following days securing the battlefield and collecting spoils. Weapons, shields, and abandoned wagons were catalogued. Wounded prisoners were treated or sent under guard to Rome. His engineers repaired the bridge and reinforced the camp, ensuring the army could continue campaigning. Caesar understood that victory was not only measured in bodies slain, but in the strategic control of the region. For the Belgic tribes, the collapse of the coalition was catastrophic. Tribes that had been united by fear of Rome now turned inward. Distrust spread. Who had fled first? Who had abandoned comrades? Tribal councils met in small, urgent gatherings, debating whether to resist Rome individually or to sue for peace. Some tribes, like the Switians, chose temporary submission, paying tribute and accepting Roman garrisons. Others retreated to dense forests, preparing for guerrilla-style resistance. Caesar's divide-and-conquer strategy was proving effective. He needed no further slaughter to weaken his enemy's psychological dominance, and careful diplomacy did the rest. Caesar himself recorded these events in his Commentary De Bello Gallico. He emphasized the bravery of the Belgi, portraying the victory as a triumph over the bravest of all Gauls, even while downplaying the logistical and tactical genius that had ensured Roman success. To Roman audiences, the battle was not only a military victory but a political one. It enhanced Caesar's reputation as a commander, capable of facing overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, Rome's northern frontier was more secure. With the Belgic coalition broken, Caesar could now consolidate alliances with more compliant tribes, strengthen supply lines, and prepare for the campaigns that would follow. Yet he did not underestimate his enemies. Among the Belgi, the Nervi watched silently from the forests, learning from their comrades' mistakes, their hatred for Rome growing. The stage was set for a confrontation even more perilous than the Axona, a battle where Caesar would face the Nervi in a sudden ambush that would test the very discipline and courage of his legions. In the villages and forests of northern Gaul, the consequences of the Axona were felt deeply. Fields lay abandoned, grain stores burned, and warriors were decimated. Yet life slowly returned to normal, and stories of Roman discipline and tactical mastery spread among the tribes. The fear of Rome, now more than ever, began to shape Gallic society. The Belgi had been defeated, but not extinguished, and the next clash would prove that survival demanded cunning, unity, and courage. For Julius Caesar, the Battle of the Axona was not only fought on muddy fields and riverbanks, it was also fought in words, scrolls, and the hearts of the Roman people. Caesar knew that his survival, both as commander in Gaul and as an ambitious politician in Rome, depended on more than battlefield victories. It depended on how those victories were remembered and retold. Shortly after the campaign, Caesar composed his account of the battle in the Commentarii de Bello Gallico. These writings were more than a simple record. They were political propaganda carefully crafted for the Senate and Roman public. Caesar described the Belgic tribes as the bravest of the Gauls, by portraying them as fierce and numerous, claiming numbers of nearly 300,000 warriors. He magnified his own accomplishment. Defeating such a force made his legions appear invincible, his leadership indispensable. He framed the battle not as a cautious defensive stand, but as a calculated confrontation where Roman courage triumphed over barbarian ferocity. The Belgic attempt at the ford was recounted as proof of their boldness, but also their lack of discipline, while Roman preparedness turned the tables. Caesar's narrative gave little credit to luck or circumstance. Every outcome stemmed from his foresight. Even the Belgic retreat was depicted as panic in the face of Roman pressure, downplaying their internal struggles and hunger. In Rome, these reports achieved their purpose. Senators and citizens alike were captivated by the image of Caesar as a commander who could not only withstand the largest tribal coalition Gaul had ever seen, but utterly dismantle it. His enemies in politics, who sought to limit his command, found themselves undermined by the sheer popularity of his victories. Caesar's legions were becoming legends, and their commander the hero of the Republic. But propaganda worked in two directions. Among the Gauls, Caesar's carefully crafted image spread as well. Stories of his unbreakable fortifications, disciplined soldiers, and relentless cavalry raids carried across tribal networks. Even those who had not faced Rome directly began to fear its methods. Where once the tribes saw the legions as foreign intruders, now they saw them as a force that could not be stopped through numbers or courage alone. The psychological war, as important as the physical, tilted heavily toward Caesar. Yet not all was secure. Some in Rome grew wary of Caesar's rising star. His enemies in the Senate whispered that he was exaggerating his victories, using them to build a cult of personality. Others pointed out that Gaul was not yet pacified, that victories such as the Axona were only steps in a longer, bloodier conquest. And indeed, Caesar himself hinted at this in his writings, leaving his readers hungry for the next chapter. He teased the resilience of the Belgic tribes, the cunning of their leaders, and the growing threat of the Nervi, a tribe unlike any other, silent and disciplined, waiting for its chance to strike. Thus, the Battle of the Axona lived on not merely as a clash of armies, but as a weapon of narrative. Caesar had secured more than a military victory. He had crafted a story that elevated him above rivals, strengthened his grip on Gaul, and laid the groundwork for the campaigns to come. With the Belgic coalition shattered at the Axona, Caesar emerged stronger than ever. His legions had proven that discipline, engineering, and relentless pressure could triumph over sheer numbers. The Belgic tribes, once united in their defiance, were now fractured, fearful, and scattered. Villages smoldered, supply lines collapsed, and morale lay in ruins. For Rome, this was more than a battlefield victory. It was the subjugation of fear itself. But the war in Gaul was far from over. Caesar knew that behind the Belgic retreat lurked a more dangerous adversary. Among the tribes, one in particular stood apart, the Nervi. Unlike the others, they rejected Roman diplomacy, spurned bribes, and despised the luxuries that soft neighboring peoples. They lived austere lives, forbidding wine and foreign goods, training constantly for war. In Caesar's own words, they were the most warlike of the Belgae. Whispers of their plans spread across Gaul. The Nervi were preparing for a confrontation unlike anything Caesar had faced. They would not attack in small raids or scatter under cavalry pursuit. They intended to strike in one decisive ambush, unleashing all their fury in a single brutal clash. For Caesar and his legions, the Axona was only the beginning. Ahead lay the Battle of the Sabus, where the Nervi would come closer than any tribe to annihilating Rome's finest. The fields of the Axona still bore the scars of war, but the shadow of the Sabis loomed larger. History would remember these battles not only as tests of steel and courage, but as the crucible that forged Caesar's legend and changed the fate of Gaul forever. And if you've enjoyed this journey through one of antiquity's most decisive battles, don't forget to like and subscribe to Clash Chronicles for more epic history brought to life. Stay tuned, because the story of Julius Caesar is far from finished. The most dangerous battles are yet to come.